Have you ever tried, truly tried, to remove someone from your mind the way you'd remove a variable from an equation, only to find that without her, the entire equation stopped making sense? I have more times than I want to admit. I tried to replace her with momentum, with mission, with the sheer velocity of moving forward so fast that looking back would be physically impossible. I told myself, build something bigger, think something deeper, go somewhere she can't follow. And it worked for about 6 hours. Then night came, and with it, her. Not dramatically, not in some cinematic wave of grief, just quietly, the way a familiar song walks in through a window you forgot to close. I am a man who believes in systems, in logic, in the idea that if you design something well enough, it holds. But she broke every system I built to contain her, every time, without even trying. And here's what I've never said out loud until now: I don't think she was supposed to be contained. Stay with me, because what I'm about to tell you isn't about weakness. It's about what happens when the most honest thing a man can do is admit some people don't leave. They just change addresses, from your memory to your marrow. It's 2 a.m. The city hums 40 floors below. Every screen in the room is lit with futures, plans, systems, trajectories mapped across timelines that stretch years ahead of where I'm standing right now. The work is real. The vision is clear. The numbers make sense. Everything in this room is rational, structured, and pointing forward. And then, without warning, without permission, one quiet thought walks in and sits down at the center of all of it. Her. Not a memory I went looking for, not a wound I kept touching, just a presence, uninvited and completely at home. I've spent a long time believing that the mind is a machine, that if you feed it the right inputs, it produces the right outputs, that discipline, direction, and enough forward momentum can override anything, including feeling. I built my life on that belief. I built systems on it. I trusted it completely. And she broke it, quietly, completely, every single time. Here's what nobody tells you about trying to forget someone. The act of trying is the act of remembering. The moment you say, I will not think about her, you've already thought about her. You've handed her the exact real estate you were trying to reclaim. It's not poetry, it's neuroscience. The brain processes a suppressed thought by first activating it, then attempting to block it. And in that activation, it reinforces the neural pathway. It makes her more present, more vivid, more alive in your mind than if you'd simply let her be. I didn't know that when I started trying to forget. I thought willpower was the answer. I thought if I could build rockets, I could build walls strong enough, tall enough, airtight enough to keep one woman's memory from walking through uninvited. I was wrong.
I think quietly. I knew I was wrong even then.
Have you ever tried to delete something from your own system, only to realize the file keeps reappearing? That's what she was. Not a bug, not a glitch. She was something that had been written so deep into the architecture that every version of the software I ran afterward still carried her logic, still referenced her code, still called back to functions she had introduced before I even knew I was being changed. Love does that. Real love, not the performative kind, not the convenient kind, but the kind that asks you to become more than you were. That kind doesn't live in your memory. It lives in your operating system. And you can't delete the operating system while the machine is still running. But here's what nobody told me. I kept trying anyway. I tried to forget her in the work. I poured everything into it: the hours, the obsession, the particular madness of building things that don't yet exist. Because if your hands are full, your chest feels lighter. That's the logic. That's the deal you make with yourself. Stay busy enough, and the quiet won't find you. I tried to forget her in the vision. I focused on futures, on timelines and trajectories, and the kind of long horizon thinking that makes the present feel small. Because if you're always thinking 10 years ahead, you can't be thinking about last night. That's another deal, another system. I tried to forget her in the silence, and that was the worst one. Because silence doesn't drown anything out. Silence amplifies. Silence is where she lived most comfortably. And every time I sat still long enough to hear myself think, there she was. Not speaking, just present. The way light is present in a room, even when you're not looking at it directly. I tried. I genuinely tried. And every single time I failed. Look at me for a second. I need you to understand something. This isn't a confession about weakness. A man can be disciplined in every dimension of his life. Rigorous, relentless, clear-eyed about failure and fast on his feet, and still find one person who simply refuses to be filed away. Those two things aren't contradictions. They're the same truth seen from different angles. The angle of strength says, I will not be controlled by what I feel. The angle of honesty says, what I feel is telling me something I haven't listened to yet. I lived in the first angle for a long time. It's a clean place to live, orderly, efficient. Get a lot done there. But you do it alone. And somewhere in the architecture of all that productive solitude, a question starts forming that no amount of ambition can answer. What is it all for if no one who actually sees you is standing next to you when it's done? That question doesn't come loudly. It comes the way she did, quietly, at 2 a.m., sitting down in the middle of everything without apology. I have a theory about why we can't forget certain people. Not a romantic theory, a structural one. I believe the people we truly loved, the ones who required us to be more honest than we were comfortable being, those people don't live in our episodic memory. They live in our identity. They became part of how we make decisions, part of how we evaluate what matters, part of the invisible rubric by which we measure whether what we're doing means anything at all. You don't forget your own compass. You might try to override it, but forgetting it? No, that's not how architecture works. And that's when everything I believed about forgetting fell apart. Because I realized the goal was never the architecture of forgetting. The goal was always the architecture of understanding. Understanding what she was, what she meant, what it revealed about me, that I couldn't let her go, no matter how many systems I designed to do exactly that. The mind is a machine. I still believe that. But machines are only as intelligent as the questions they're designed to ask. And for a long time, I was asking my mind the wrong question. I was asking, how do I remove her? When the real question, the honest question, was always, why does removing her feel like removing something essential? That question changed everything. Not instantly, not cleanly, the way real shifts never are, but slowly, the way a foundation settles, the way source code stabilizes after a rebuild. I started to understand that her presence in my mind wasn't a malfunction. It was information. It was the system telling me something I hadn't been willing to hear. Some people are not meant to be deleted. They are meant to be decoded. And I had been so busy trying to delete her that I hadn't once stopped to read what she was trying to tell me. I am starting to read it now. Don't deny it. You know exactly what I mean. Because you've been here too, in this 2 a.m. room, with all your screens lit and all your plans in order, and one quiet thought sitting in the middle of it all, refusing to leave. You didn't fail at forgetting them. You discovered that they mattered. That's not a weakness. That's the most human kind of intelligence there is. There is a law in physics that most people learn and then quietly forget. It says that any object with enough mass will bend the space around it. Not forcefully, not violently, just inevitably. The way the sun doesn't chase the planets. It simply exists with enough presence that everything nearby begins to curve toward it, begins to orbit, without being asked, without being commanded. Just because the pull is real and physics doesn't negotiate. She was like that. And I didn't notice it happening until I was already in orbit. That's the thing about gravity. You don't feel it pulling you. You just look up one day and realize everything you've been building, every direction you've been moving, has been quietly curving toward one center point, one person, one presence that you never formally appointed as the axis of anything, but somehow became exactly that. I am someone who tracks systems obsessively. I notice inefficiencies before they become failures. I see patterns in data before they announce themselves. I am, by nature and by practice, someone who pays attention to what's actually running underneath what appears to be running. And I missed her gravity completely. Not because I wasn't paying attention, but because she didn't announce herself. She didn't arrive with force or demand, or the kind of loudness that triggers your defenses. She arrived the way the most transformative things always do: gently, consistently, over time. She showed up in the small spaces, the in between moments, the parts of the day that don't make it into any calendar or plan. She showed up in the Tuesday afternoon when everything had gone wrong, and she didn't try to fix it. She just sat with it alongside me. In the moment, I said something half formed and uncertain, and she didn't wait for me to finish polishing it. She understood the raw version. In the way she once looked at me, not as the version of me the world was watching, but as the version of me that existed before I knew I was being watched. That's a rare thing, rarer than people admit. Have you ever been truly seen by someone? Not admired, not evaluated, not impressed or disappointed, just seen. Seen the way a room is seen when you turn the lights on, all of it. The structure and the shadows, the clean lines and the unfinished corners. And the person seeing it doesn't flinch, doesn't redecorate, they just look, and they stay. That's what she did. And I didn't know how much I needed it until she was doing it. And I didn't know how much I'd taken it for granted until she wasn't. But here's what nobody told me: gravity doesn't disappear when the object moves away, the curvature remains. The architecture of the space she shaped around her still exists, even when she is no longer at the center of it. And you keep moving in the same curved lines, the same arcing trajectories, as if she's still there, as if the orbit is still active, as if the physics of her presence didn't end just because her presence did. I kept building things, and somewhere in the structure of every one of them, there was a shape that fit her, a detail she would have noticed, a decision she would have understood when no one else did, a quiet corner of something enormous that was, if I'm honest, built with her in mind. Not symbolically, specifically, the way a man builds a room for someone he expects to come home. That's not sentimentality. That's gravity. Still operating, still bending the trajectory of everything I do toward a center point that is no longer standing there to receive it. And I had to ask myself, at some point, sitting in the hum of another late night, in the middle of another thing I was building, I had to ask, is this strength or is this avoidance? Am I building forward or am I building in circles around something I haven't acknowledged? That question required more honesty than most questions I've asked myself. Here is the uncomfortable truth. When someone becomes your gravitational center, when you have allowed yourself to be shaped by their presence at that level, losing them doesn't mean returning to who you were before. You can't. The space around you has already been curved. You are already different. The version of you that existed before her gravity is not the version standing here now. And no amount of forward movement changes the fact that the curvature is still written into the trajectory. You move forward, yes, but the shape of how you move is still hers. I spent a long time treating that as a liability, as something to correct, as evidence that I hadn't fully moved on, hadn't fully rebuilt, hadn't fully returned to a clean baseline. I treated her gravity like a defect in the system, something to recalibrate away from. I was solving for the wrong variable. Look at me for a second. What if her gravity wasn't the problem? What if it was, quietly, stubbornly, without your permission, the thing that kept you from flying completely off course? What if the orbit she created was actually the thing that kept you in range of something real, while everything else in your life was accelerating you toward a destination that was impressive but hollow? I think about that now. I think about how many decisions I made in the months after her, in the years that followed, and how many of them were secretly calibrated against what she would have thought, not to please her, not to perform for her, but because her perspective had become part of my internal measurement system. She had become one of the invisible metrics by which I evaluated whether something was genuinely worth doing or merely impressive. That is not a small thing. That is not something you architect into a person deliberately. That is something that only happens when someone is real enough and present enough and honest enough with you that their way of seeing things becomes woven into your way of seeing things. She changed how I see, and you can't unchange that. You can only decide what to do with the new vision. Here is what I know about gravity now that I didn't know then. The planets don't fight the sun. They don't spend their orbits resisting the pull that organizes them. They simply move in the direction their nature and physics design them to move. And in doing so, they maintain their own shape, their own speed, their own unique path, even while being held by something larger than themselves. That is not dependency. That is relationship. That is the difference between being consumed by someone and being organized by someone. The difference between losing yourself in a person and finding that a person has given your movement meaning and direction. She didn't make me smaller. She made the space I moved through more legible. And now that she is gone, or not gone, but shifted, relocated to a quieter part of everything, the space is still legible. The curvature is still there. The lines she introduced are still running underneath every decision, every build, every late night choice to keep going, when the logical thing would be to stop. She is still the center of something, not of my life as it exists today, but of the gravity that holds the most human parts of me in place. And I don't think I want to escape that anymore. I think I finally understand that some orbits are not prisons. They are proof. Proof that something real happened. Proof that she was not a chapter. She was a law. A law of the particular physics of who I am. And laws don't get deleted. They get understood. I have built things that failed. Real failures, not the polished, retrospectively meaningful kind that make for clean stories, but the raw kind. The kind where the math was right and it still didn't hold. Where the preparation was thorough and the outcome was brutal. Where you stand in the wreckage of something you gave everything to, and you have to make a decision in that exact moment about what the failure means. I've made that decision many times about systems, about structures, about bets that didn't come in. And every time, the framework was the same. Analyze what broke, understand why, extract the lesson, rebuild better, move forward with more information than you had before. I tried to apply that framework to forgetting her. It didn't work, obviously. But what I want to tell you, what I think is worth saying out loud, is what I found in the wreckage of that failure. Because failure, when you're honest enough to sit inside it, without immediately reconstructing your defenses, has a way of teaching you things that success never could. And failing to forget her taught me more about who I am than almost anything I've ever succeeded at. Here's the first thing I learned. The depth of your inability to forget someone is a direct measurement of the depth of what was real. Not what you wished was real. Not what you performed for the world. What was actually, genuinely, structurally real between you. The memory that refuses to dissolve is the memory that was made of something substantial. You don't struggle to forget things that didn't matter. You only fight this hard to release something that genuinely held weight. Think about that. Every time I failed to forget her, every morning I woke up and she was already there before I'd consciously decided anything. Every quiet moment she walked back in without knocking. Every one of those failures was the mind's honest testimony that what we had was real. Not convenient, not constructed, real. The failure was proof, and I had been treating the proof like a problem. Have you ever done that? Taken the evidence of something meaningful and tried to dismantle it because it was inconvenient? Because it didn't fit neatly into the life you were trying to build in her absence? Because admitting that it was real meant admitting that losing it actually cost you something, and that kind of admission requires a vulnerability that most of us have learned to root around? I had learned to root around it, efficiently, for a long time. But here's what nobody told me. You cannot grow past something you refuse to honestly measure. You cannot build a stronger version of yourself on a foundation that includes a denial. And I was denying, quietly, systematically, with great discipline, that losing her had left a specific kind of absence in the architecture of who I was. An absence shaped exactly like her, not a wound, exactly, more like a load-bearing wall that had been removed. Everything still standing. But you could feel, if you paid attention, that something was working harder than it should have, to hold the structure upright. I was working harder than I should have, and I called it ambition. I called it drive. I called it the natural behavior of a man who has things to build and miles to cover. And most of those things were true. But underneath all of it, underneath the momentum and the mission and the velocity, was a man who had quietly lost the one person who made the silence feel like enough. That's the confession I avoided for longer than I should have. And here is the uncomfortable truth that came with it. The repeated failure to forget her wasn't a sign that I was weak. It was a sign that I had been strong in the wrong direction. I had been applying massive force, the full force of my focus, my ambition, my ability to override anything that slowed me down, to the wrong objective. I wasn't trying to heal. I was trying to erase. And those are not the same thing. Healing integrates. Erasing amputates. And you cannot amputate something that is already structurally part of you without causing damage to the whole. I caused damage. I didn't know it at the time. I thought I was being disciplined. I thought refusing to acknowledge the ache was the same as transcending it. I thought if I never said her name out loud in the context of loss, then the loss wouldn't be real. But silence doesn't neutralize grief. It pressurizes it. And pressurized things, I know this better than most, eventually find release. Not always at the time you'd choose, not always in the form you'd prefer, but always. The physics are non-negotiable. There is a concept I kept coming back to during those months of attempted forgetting. It's the idea that emotional suppression doesn't eliminate an experience. It simply relocates it, pushes it below the level of conscious awareness, where it continues operating without your oversight, which means you make decisions influenced by something you've convinced yourself you've dealt with. You react to situations shaped by something you've convinced yourself you've released. You build things, and sometimes entire seasons of your life, under the silent influence of something you swore you'd left behind. I built some things under that influence. I can see it now. I couldn't see it then. What I could see then was the failure itself, this repeating, humbling, infuriating failure to do the one thing I'd set my mind to simply move on, to simply stop, to simply be the man who processed, concluded, and redirected his energy like every rational framework said he should be able to. But here's what the failure was actually teaching me. Underneath all the frustration of it was teaching me that love, real love, doesn't operate within a rational framework, not because it's irrational, but because it operates at a deeper layer of the architecture than reason does. Reason lives on the surface. It's fast, clean, efficient, and it's the first thing you reach for. But love, when it's real, installs itself below the operating system, in the BIOS, in the layer that runs before anything else loads, before reason, before language, before the version of you that knows how to manage an impression. And you cannot update the BIOS from within the operating system. You have to go deeper than thought to touch it. I didn't know how to go that deep. I had never needed to. Every other problem in my life could be solved from the surface layer, with enough intelligence, enough information, enough willingness to work. But this one required something I hadn't practiced, something that felt dangerously close to surrender. It required me to stop fighting the failure, to sit inside it without trying to extract a lesson or build a solution or convert the pain into productivity, to just feel it, the full weight of it, the specific shape of what was missing, the exact texture of the absence she left. That was the hardest thing I have ever done. Not because the feeling was unbearable, but because I had spent so long believing that feeling deeply was a form of losing. That a man who let himself be moved was a man who had lost control of his own architecture. I know now that the opposite is true. The man who refuses to be moved is not in control. He is just numb. And numbness is not strength, it is protection masquerading as power. Real strength is feeling the full weight of something real and choosing to carry it consciously instead of letting it carry you unconsciously from below the surface where you can't see what's driving you. I failed to forget her, over and over, without grace, without efficiency, without the clean arc of a man who processes and moves on. And in that failure, in the specific, repeated, humbling shape of it, I found the truest thing I've ever known about myself. I loved her. Not past tense dressed up as present tense, not memory performing as feeling. Actually loved her in the way that changes the composition of who you are, in the way that doesn't ask permission and doesn't accept a refund. And knowing that, truly knowing it, without the defenses, was not the end of something. It was the beginning of being honest. There is a particular kind of morning that only a builder knows. The kind where you open your eyes before the alarm, before the light, before the world has remembered to start making noise, and the first thing you feel is not excitement, not dread, just the quiet, specific weight of everything that is still unfinished. Every system still mid-build, every vision still mid-proof, every structure that exists only in your mind and is waiting, patiently, stubbornly, to be made real. I know that morning well. I have lived inside it for most of my life. But there is a version of that morning that is different from all the others. A version that arrives only in the season after someone significant leaves, where the unfinished weight is not just professional, not just visionary, it is personal. It is the unfinished business of becoming someone whole again, of learning how to build when one of the core reasons you were building has quietly relocated, and you are standing at the workbench wondering, for the first time in a long time, who exactly this is all for. I stood at that workbench longer than I expected, longer than I thought was acceptable for someone with as much direction as I believed I had. And what I discovered there, in that in-between place, that gap between what was and what hadn't yet become, was something I didn't expect to find. I discovered that she had not taken the building impulse with her. She had deepened it. Here is what I mean. When someone becomes genuinely important to you, when they become part of the invisible architecture of your motivation, their absence doesn't hollow out your drive. It clarifies it. It strips away the layers of ambition that were actually performance, the goals that were secretly designed to impress, the direction that was partly real and partly constructed for an audience of one that is no longer watching. And what remains, after the performance layer dissolves, is the raw material, the actual reason, the bedrock thing underneath everything else that makes you a builder in the first place. Her absence burned away everything that was decoration. What was left was real. But here's what nobody told me. Building from that place, from the stripped down, no audience, only truth place, is harder and better. Harder because you can't coast on the performance layer anymore. You can't tell yourself you're doing it for the vision when the vision has gone quiet, and all that remains is the raw impulse to create something that matters. Better because when you build from that place, what you build actually holds, not just structurally, but internally. You build things you can stand inside without flinching, things that don't require a story to justify them, things that exist because you needed them to exist, not because you needed someone to see you making them. That distinction took me a long time to understand. Between building to be seen and building because the building itself is the point. She was in the room when I learned it, and she was gone when I finally applied it. And somehow, in the particular irony that only life can produce with a straight face, the lesson became most useful in her absence. I want to tell you something about purpose. Not the motivational version of it, not the clean, packaged, trajectory has a destination version that sounds right in a speech. The actual version. The one that lives in the 2 a.m. of it, in the doubt-saturated middle of it, in the part of it that nobody talks about because it doesn't photograph well. Purpose, in its real form, is not a destination. It is a direction held under pressure. It is the thing you keep moving toward, even when the original reason for moving has changed. Even when the person who first made the direction feel worth taking is no longer walking beside you. Even when the only evidence that the direction is right is the fact that turning back feels more wrong than continuing forward. That is what purpose actually feels like from inside it. Not inspiring, just true. And in her absence, in the specific pressure of building without her there, to understand why, I found out what my purpose was actually made of. I found out which parts of it were structural and which parts were scenic, which parts held under pressure and which parts had been quietly depending on her presence to feel meaningful. The scenic parts fell away, and I let them. Have you ever had to let something fall away that you'd been holding on to because it felt like the last connection to something you'd lost? A habit, a ritual, a specific way of working that was secretly a way of staying close to a season that was over? I held on to several of those, not consciously, the way you hold on to things that feel like protection, without examining whether what they're protecting you from is actually dangerous or just different. I held on to the version of ambition that she had witnessed. I kept building in the style she knew, not because it was the best style, but because it felt like a continuation of a conversation we'd been having. Like if I kept building in a way she would recognize, some thread between us remained intact. And that's when everything shifted. Because one morning, one specific, unremarkable, ordinary morning, I started building something new, something she had never seen, something that didn't reference the conversation we'd been having, something that was entirely, uncomplicatedly mine. Mine in a way that nothing had been since before her gravity organized my trajectory. Mine the way the earliest ideas are, before they get refined by audience, shaped by expectation, or softened by the need for someone else's approval. It felt strange and clean, like breathing with full lungs after a long time of taking careful, conservative breaths. Here's the uncomfortable truth I found in that moment. Absence, real, aching, unresolved absence, is one of the most generative forces a builder can encounter. Not because pain is useful romantically, not because suffering produces wisdom automatically, but because absence creates a specific kind of hunger, a hunger for meaning that cannot be satisfied by productivity alone, a hunger that asks, not just what am I building, but who am I building it as? And that question, that identity level question, is the one that produces the most honest, most original, most structurally sound work you will ever do. She was not in the room when I built those things, but she was in the formation of the person doing the building. She was in the clarified vision, in the stripped down purpose, in the particular quality of honesty I brought to the work, because the performance layer was gone, and all that remained was the truth of what I actually cared about. I built in her absence. I built differently than I had ever built before. I built without an audience of one watching quietly from across the room. And the things I built were better, not because she was gone, but because she had already done her work, the deep, invisible, irreversible work of changing the person at the workbench. The person who wakes up at 2 a.m., not to impress anyone, not to prove anything, not to maintain the orbit of someone else's expectations, but simply because there is something true that needs to be made real. That person exists because she existed. And every structure he builds from here forward, every vision, every system, every late night decision to keep going, carries her logic in it. Not as a wound, not as a tribute, as foundation. The source code she introduced is still running, quietly, efficiently, in every version of the software that has come since, and the software is better for it. That is not a small thing to say. That is not sentiment dressed as insight. That is the most honest engineering report I have ever written about the most important system I have ever tried to understand.
Myself.
I want to tell you something about surrender, because I think we've gotten it wrong. Deeply, systematically, culturally wrong. We've built an entire architecture of self-respect around the idea that surrender is the opposite of strength. That the man who holds on, who pushes through, who refuses to yield, that man is the one worth becoming. And the man who lets go, who softens, who admits that something was bigger than his ability to control it, that man has lost. I believed that. For a long time, I built my entire interior life on that belief. And then she came along, and then she left. And then I spent years trying to prove the belief was right by refusing to surrender to what her absence actually meant. And I was exhausted. Quietly, structurally, in the deep load-bearing parts of me, exhausted. Not from the work, never from the work, from the resistance, from the daily, disciplined, relentless act of holding a position against something that wasn't attacking me, something that was simply true. The truth was simple. She mattered. She still mattered. The attempt to forget had failed not because I was weak, but because what we had was real, and real things don't dissolve on command. And all the energy I had spent resisting that truth, all the productivity and velocity and forward motion I had generated in the name of moving on, had been, at its core, the most elaborate avoidance strategy I had ever designed. I am good at designing systems. Apparently, I am also good at designing the ones that protect me from myself. But here's what nobody told me. The moment you stop resisting the truth, the moment you open your hands and let it land, something unexpected happens. Not collapse, not the emotional avalanche you spent all that energy preventing. Something quieter. Something that feels, against all logic, like relief. Like a system that has been running a background process for years, consuming memory, consuming energy, slowing everything else down, finally completing and closing. And the whole machine breathes differently. That is what surrender felt like. Not defeat, not weakness, not the end of something I was supposed to protect. Just honesty finally arriving at the place where I lived, sitting down without apology, staying. I surrender to this. She was not a chapter. She was not a phase, a lesson neatly packaged, a season with a defined beginning and end that I could annotate and archive and reference for growth. She was a person, a specific, irreplaceable, entirely real person who saw me in a way that required me to be more honest than I was comfortable being. And what happened between us, whatever shape it took, whatever form it held or failed to hold, was real in the way that only a few things in a life ever are. Surrendering to that doesn't make me less. It makes me accurate. Have you ever noticed how much energy it takes to maintain a simplified version of something complex? How much daily invisible effort goes into holding the story at the level of, I've moved on, when the truth is operating at the level of, I carry this with me, and I've learned to walk with the weight. Those are not the same story, and living in the simplified version while the complex one runs underneath is one of the most quietly exhausting things a human being can do. I lived in that gap for years. I am not living there anymore. Here is what I know about the people we cannot forget. They are not failures of our resilience. They are evidence of our capacity. Evidence that we were open enough, real enough, present enough to let someone in at the level where they could actually change us. Most people never get that far with anyone. Most people maintain enough distance, enough protective glass between themselves and another human being that no one ever really gets to the load-bearing walls. No one ever touches the architecture underneath the presentation. She got there. I let her. And the fact that I cannot forget her is not a sign that I failed to protect myself. It is a sign that I was, in that window of time, fully alive. And I would rather be the man who loved that completely and carries it consciously than the man who kept everyone at the level of the lobby safe, managed, impressive from a distance, and entirely alone in the rooms that actually matter. Look at me for a second. I need you to hear this part. Surrendering to what she meant is not the same as being trapped by it. That distinction is everything. Surrender, in the honest sense, is not the act of lying down in the wreckage and calling it home. It is the act of acknowledging the wreckage fully, its real dimensions, its real weight, its real impact on the structure of who you are, and then choosing, from that honest place, what to build next. You cannot build well from denial. You can build quickly from it. You can build impressively from it, but not well. Not the kind of building that holds when the pressure is real and the stakes are high, and the only thing keeping the structure upright is the integrity of what it was built on. I want to build well. I always have. And building well requires honest foundations. And honest foundations require the courage to measure what is actually there, including the parts that hurt to look at directly. She is part of my foundation now, not as limitation, as material, the specific, load-bearing kind. There is a growth framework I have come to trust more than any other. Not the kind that asks you to become someone new, the kind that asks you to become more honestly the person you already are, to strip away the constructed layers, the performance, the protection, the strategic presentation, and find the actual self underneath all of it. The one that existed before you learned what to hide and how to hide it. She helped me find that person, not intentionally, not as a project, just by being honest herself, by being the kind of present that makes dishonesty feel uncomfortable rather than safe. And the version of me that emerged in her presence, unguarded, uncertain, real in the way that only a few people ever see, that version is the one I am most interested in now, the one I want to keep building from, the one I want to bring to everything. She made me more myself, and I failed to forget her because you cannot forget a mirror that showed you something true. Some people are not meant to be forgotten. They are meant to be integrated, carried forward, not as grief, not as longing, not as the ghost of something that should have lasted longer, but as the permanent, positive alteration of who you became in their company. The version of you that only exists because they existed. The intelligence, the honesty, the particular quality of openness that you had not been capable of before them, and cannot now be without. That is not a wound. That is inheritance. And what do you do with an inheritance? You don't bury it. You don't pretend it isn't there. You don't spend your life trying to return it to a sender who is no longer at that address. You receive it, fully, honestly, with both hands open. You let it become part of what you build going forward. You let it mean something, not in the past tense of grief, but in the present tense of who you actually are. I receive it. I receive her, not as the woman I am still reaching for, not as the absence I am still mourning, but as the irreversible, structural, load-bearing contribution she made to the person now standing here, building forward, eyes open, hands no longer trying to delete source code they could never have lived without. Originally, I tried to forget her. I failed. Again and again and again, I failed with great effort and absolute consistency, and not a single exception. And the failure was the gift, because every time I failed, I was forced one layer deeper into the truth of what she was. And the deeper I went, the more I understood that the goal was never to forget. The goal, the real one, the one underneath all the noise of moving on, was to understand. To understand what she meant, what I was in her company, what it revealed about the kind of man I was capable of being when someone gave me the conditions to be honest. I understand it now. Maybe that's the truth I was always avoiding. I didn't fail at forgetting her. I succeeded at becoming someone who was worth remembering. And somewhere in the silence between those two things, she is still there. Not as a wound, as the reason the whole thing was ever worth building at all.